Today's lecture is underwritten by the Kevin and Joan Keogh family and their fund. The Keoghs have been coming to Chautauqua for over 40 years. Joan's a former member of our Board of Trustees and has served on the board of the Chautauqua Catholic community. Their children and grandchildren are here each summer. I want to thank them for their support and thank all of our families for their contributions to Chautauqua. I think Obi Felten may have the most incredible job title on the planet, and I quote, "Head of getting moonshots ready for contact with the real world." She holds this position at X, the research company formerly known as Google X. The primary mission at X is to find and solve large problems via radical technology solutions. As the director of X Foundry, Ms. Felten helps to hone these new technologies into real products and to draft business plans to bring these inventions to the real world. In addition to her work at X, Ms. Felten is a startup mentor and an angel investor. She helped set up Campus London, a Google-funded space aimed at encouraging a startup community. She also serves on the board of Shift, a nonprofit focusing on social problems, and on the board of Picasso Labs, a tech startup. Prior to her work at X, Ms. Felten spent several years starting and growing e-commerce businesses for retailers. And most recently, she served as Director of Consumer Marketing for Google in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Ms. Felten holds degrees in philosophy and psychology from Oxford University, and we're thrilled to have her on our platform this morning for the first lecture in this new amphitheater. She's also joined by her husband, Toby Mason, and their two children, who I'm told are experiencing club for the first time today. And in the small world moments of Chautauqua, she's also a Youth for Understanding student who had come here on exchange from Germany and was placed in upstate New York. And when she asked if I had heard of it, I said, yes, that's where I was president right before I came here. So please join me in welcoming Obi Felten to Chautauqua.
Good morning. I am honored to be giving the first lecture of the 144th season within this magnificent new tent and opening this week's conversation about invention. So, as Michael said, I'm head of getting moonshots ready for contact with the real world at X, and that is, yes, my real job title. And I am just delighted to be here. Alan Kay, a computer scientist at Xerox PARC, said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. At X, we work on projects like this: self-driving cars, delivery drones, contact lenses for diabetics that measure the glucose in your tears, energy kites, think of it like a flying wind turbine that's tethered like a kite, carbon-neutral fuel from seawater, and internet from balloons. The New York Times said that we're also working on a space elevator, but I can confirm that's not the case, because as far as we know, space elevators do still break the laws of Newton. So we call ourselves a moonshot factory, and we aim to solve large problems in the world with the help of technology. We define a moonshot, a technology moonshot, as follows. We start with a large problem in the world, something that will affect millions or even billions of people if it was solved. We propose a radical solution. Sounds like science fiction today. But then we work on a breakthrough technology that can turn the fiction into reality. In my day job, I think a lot about the future. I'm also the daughter of a history professor who taught me to learn from the past. So I will explore this topic of invention and innovation from both perspectives. I will take you back in time, and I will try to give you a glimpse of what the future might look like. In the first part of my talk, I will argue that every generation is living in modern times. As new technologies emerge, they create a sense of dislocation until the benefits are felt. I will talk about the modern times of our lifetime, the internet age and the automation age. In the second part, I will talk about the conditions for invention and innovation. I will pay tribute to the great labs of the past, such as Bell Labs, and I will share some lessons from X, including how to deal with failure. And in the final part, I will ask how the accelerating growth of technology might affect our society, with rising inequality and the impact of automation on jobs. I am an optimist. I will admit it up front. I believe that we can and we must harness technology to help solve the world's largest problems with more inclusive innovation. And it is up to us how we use technology to make the future better for ourselves and for generations to come. So as we start, let's start with some definitions. So this week is all about invention, but I predict that we'll be talking a lot about innovation as well. And sometimes the two words are used interchangeably, but there are some differences and they have different Latin roots. So invention is the act of discovery. It's about creativity and creating. Innovation is the application of invention for better solutions. And I thought it was interesting that the use of the word invention has actually been decreasing and the use of the word innovation is going up. So I was worried, is there not enough invention anymore? And I checked the number of patents. You'll be reassured to know that the number of patents is still going up, so there's still plenty of invention going on. Let me give you an example. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell back in 1876, was a true invention. Nothing like it had ever existed before. He created the first voice call. But the smartphone is an innovation. When the iPhone came out, it contained no new parts. Even the touchscreen, the most famous part of it, had been used in Apple's Newton device, a big failure, 10 years earlier. But they were cleverly integrated to make it useful. And of course, we're all still waiting for the Star Trek communicator, which would be the true communication device. So in my mind, the two concepts are inextricably linked. There's no innovation without invention, but an invention doesn't have an impact on the world without innovation. Every generation is living in modern times. The poet and literary critic Adam Kirsch noted that we like to think of ourselves as living in an age of unprecedented disruption. This is not new. In fact, a time traveler traveling back 100, 200, 300, even 400 years would see every generation feeling both pride and anxiety about its inventions. 400 years ago, the discovery of heliocentrism created a huge sense of dislocation. And John Donne wrote this poem, Anatomy of the World, in 1611. The sun is lost in the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. What has changed in our time is that the pace of technology development has sped up. So people have less time to get used to this sense of dislocation and get over it. We today live in connected times. Our modern age is the internet, which became truly useful in 1989 with the invention of the World Wide Web. So the last 2 decades have seen the creation of a virtual world. We live in San Francisco, and my children think it's completely normal to have breakfast with my parents who live in Germany. And here you see a picture of my daughter who's actually opening her birthday presents with my parents on video conference. There are now over 4 billion smartphone users in the world. 1 billion of those are in China, and 270 million of those are in India. But not all of us benefit from this yet. Over half of the world's population lacks access to the internet, especially in remote, rural, and poor areas of the world. So why does that matter? It matters because they miss out on the demonstrated benefits of the internet: increases in GDP, small business growth, increased crop yields, lifting people out of poverty, and saving lives. At X, we have a project called Loon. And Project Loon's radical solution is to go up. A network of balloons that are floating on the edge of space, 20 kilometers up in the stratosphere, right way above air traffic and birds, you'll be pleased to know, and also above the weather, which is useful because weather is not very good for balloons. It sounded crazy at first. There's a reason it's called Project Loon. But before I talk more about Project Loon, allow me a brief historical diversion into the history of stratospheric balloons. In the 1930s, Auguste Piccard made the first stratospheric balloon. He designed and built a spherical pressurized aluminum chamber that was carried by a hydrogen-filled balloon, the first ever space capsule. Piccard and his assistant, Paul Kipfer, made their first flight in 1931 from Augsburg, Germany. And they reached an altitude of 50,788 feet. And they were able to measure cosmic rays and take many other useful scientific measurements. Now, you might be wondering about those wicker baskets on their head, and Piccard explains what they are in his notebook. Both of us were protected against knocks on the head by a basket stuffed with a cushion. During our ascent, the baskets contained several backup items, and the cushions embellished our wicker seats. In case of a sea landing, the cushions with their cowpoke filling would have served as a life vest. Perhaps not surprising, Piccard was the inspiration for Professor Calculus in the Tintin books. In the 1950s, engineers at NASA and Bell Labs designed the first communications satellite. It was actually a balloon. It was a passive spacecraft based on a balloon design. And once it was in orbit, the fully inflated balloon reflected radio transmissions from one ground station to another. And President Eisenhower himself made the first ever satellite call. This is Rich. Rich is one of the inventors of Project Loon. His idea was to not just have one balloon, but a flock of balloons that would roam together and form a network. As soon as one balloon floats out of range of your phone, another one comes along to provide connectivity. To make this work, the team had to solve a lot of technical challenges. Data transmission between the balloons, data transmission from the balloons 20 kilometers up, back down to your phone on the ground. And of course, making the balloon itself. A major issue in the early days was leaks. So you know the day after a kid's birthday party, when the beautiful floating balloons don't float anymore? That happened to us a few weeks ago when our daughter turned 4. But it also happened to the Loon team. Our balloons were supposed to last 100 days. The first balloons lasted 5 days. We set up a special testing team, led by Pam. Here she is. She is our head balloonatic. That is her real job title as well. They studied other products where leaks really matter, like chips packets and sausage casings. They ran many experiments, like running a helium detector on the outside of the balloons to see where the helium leaked out. Most of them failed. But there was one experiment that they ran in our balloon factory. And it was to see whether the socks worn by the manufacturing team would make a difference, because they walk around on the balloon material. And so the team did a line dance on the balloon, first wearing normal socks, and then they did another line dance wearing super soft fluffy socks. And yes, the fluffy socks did help to prevent damage, and now only fluffy socks are allowed in the balloon factories. Back in the Loon lab, Pam and the team built a giant light table, which they affectionately call Billie Jean. When the balloons come down from the stratosphere, they get laid out on Billie Jean and inspected for damage. And of course, Pam only allows shark slippers to be worn, because otherwise, if you're wearing normal socks, you might be damaging the balloon. In 2013, Loon did its first test flights in New Zealand. I was pregnant at the time, so I had a bet with the engineers. about who was going to launch first, their balloon or our daughter. She actually arrived 10 days early, so I beat the engineers by a really good margin. The first test user we connected was Charles. He was a sheep farmer, and the first thing he did was check the weather. So here's a video of his first impressions.
I run a small farm. When I'm using the internet, the first thing I'll check is the weather, to see if my sheep are going to dry out. And at the moment, the wool's not dry. So I'm just looking for a window so I can plan my week. We've gone through a number of different internet providers to try and get reliable internet. It was so slow that we had to click on a page and go and find something to do for 10 minutes.
So can you give us a quick update on the launch?
Having a team from Google on our farm to trial this for the first time has been really exciting.
All right, coming out, 3, 2, 1. Straight up, straight up, straight up, straight up.
Starting today, we're launching a few dozen balloons so that 50 testers right here in the Christchurch area can get online through this experimental balloon network.
Bingo. Yay! And that was fast too. To be the first person to do that is a little bit cool as well.
Having access to the internet can change lives, and there are 5 billion people on the Earth that aren't reached. Balloon-powered internet sounds positively mad, and in a way it is, but it's mad in a very practical way that could just work.
There you go. So Charles only got a few minutes of a actually very slow connection because it was Wi-Fi. But the Loon team has come a long way since then. So we've flown over 19 million kilometers of test flights, and one of our record-breaking balloons managed to survive for 190 days. So we solved our leak problems. And working with mobile phone companies, we're also now able to provide internet connectivity at LTE speeds. In March, major floods hit Peru. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, and the communications network was knocked out in many places. Loon had been flying balloons all over Latin America with our partner, Telefonica. And when the floods hit, Telefonica and us went to the Peruvian government and asked if we could help. So we've been providing basic connectivity to people in the flood zones. And I want to show you this video.
This is the first time Loon has tried to deploy in a disaster scenario. We know that Loon has tremendous advantages for these types of settings, but we haven't had an opportunity to go out and make a difference in a disaster. So it's still pretty early days for Project Loon, but we're one step closer to bringing the third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, to everyone on Earth. But the next industrial revolution is upon us already.
And the fourth industrial revolution will bring a fusion of the virtual, the physical, and the biological spheres. It's bringing together many technologies: artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, material science, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and more. Autonomous cars are an example of the fusion of the physical and the virtual. In the 1960s, Isaac Asimov predicted that there would be cars with robot brains who would be more reliable than human drivers. But the history of autonomous vehicles actually dates back to medieval times. Leonardo da Vinci drew this beautiful sketch of a self-propelled cart around 1478, probably as a design for a theater prop. We don't quite know. It can be programmed, and it's wound up by the main strings in the middle. There's various other parts, including a braking system. When Henry Ford was coming to Chautauqua in the 1920s and 30s, self-driving cars were definitely the thing of science fiction. For the World Fair in 1939, General Motors sponsored this Futurama exhibit where people sat on chairs going around an imagined city of tomorrow, complete with automated highways. In this wonderful ad from 1957 for an electricity company, the autonomous cars are speeding along an electric superhighway. I particularly love that the family is playing dominoes, because today we talk about how we could be checking our email and the kids would probably be watching YouTube videos. Also in the 1950s, GM and RCA developed automated highway prototypes with radio control for speed and steering. And the way this worked was that there were magnets in the cars that were tracking a steel cable that was embedded in the road, and then control towers that managed the overall traffic. But the infrastructure that this system would require was never put in place, and the smart highways never materialized. This meant that the cars to be autonomous were on their own. By the 1960s, artificial intelligence researchers imagined vehicles that were smart enough to navigate on their own by sensing, processing, and then making decisions. But first, in the 1970s, the autonomous vehicle industry left Earth altogether and went to Mars for the first Mars rovers. And arguably, it might be slightly easier to maneuver on Mars than on streets on Earth these days. In the 1980s, German aerospace engineer Ernst Dickmanns of the Bundeswehr-Universität in Munich designed the first vehicles with vision-based systems for guidance. And that was a really big breakthrough because they were the first truly independent vehicles, and he drove hundreds of miles of Autobahn autonomously. And this earned him the title of pioneer of autonomous vehicles. But things didn't really start speeding up properly until the 2000s, when DARPA set a bunch of challenges for autonomous cars. The first DARPA challenge was in 2004, and all the entrants failed miserably. Not a single car completed the entire course, which was 130 miles. In fact, there was the one that got the furthest, Carnegie Mellon Sandstorm, traveled just 7.3 miles before it also ended up in a ditch. But just 1 year later, Stanford's Stanley car wins the 132-mile race in just under 7 hours. And in 2007, in the Urban Challenge, Carnegie Mellon's boss wins. Stanford's junior takes second place. You can see a certain virally emerging here, right, between Stanford and Carnegie Mellon. In 2009, the two teams come together at Google. Sebastian Thun from Stanford and Chris Urmson from Carnegie Mellon actually joined forces in the Google self-driving car project. I tried to find a picture of the two of them. Apparently there isn't one from those early days where they're both together. So this is actually the Google founders who are very happy that they arrived. They also added a few NASA engineers, including Jamie Wado, who worked on the Mars rover, which turned out to be useful prep for our self-driving car. So why do we suddenly have this big leap forward in the 2000s? In the past 10 years, there are several technologies that have come to maturity, such as sensors, computer vision, image processing. The sheer processing power of computers and the fact that we can do this in the cloud so that every car can learn from the next. Also, mapping have progressed rapidly, and they all come together in the self-driving car. Like any human driver, self-driving cars have to answer 4 questions. Where am I? What's around me? What will happen next? And what should I do about it? So our approach to this problem is as follows. We first create complex maps that include detailed information like the road profiles and the curbs. So our cars do not have to rely on a human navigator that sits next to them and can be blamed for going the wrong way. We then take these detailed maps and we combine them with live information from our sensors. We have multiple sensors that you see on the bottom right. So there's radar, which can see 200 meters in any direction. There's a LiDAR, a spinning laser, that can see 360 degrees around. There are cameras, and there's even a sound detector so that we can hear ambulances. Each car learns from previous journeys, and we've now driven over 3 million test miles. So the self-driving car became the founding project for what was then called Google X. And the problem we're trying to solve is safety, because 1.2 million people die on the road each year, and 94% of those accidents are caused by human error. So the radical solution was a car that drives itself. It's never distracted, it's never drunk, it's never texting. About 4 years ago, the team was ready to try out their technology on some unsuspecting fellow Googlers. 10 people volunteered to drive this Lexus car to and from their work in Mountain View. The car was fitted with our software and also some of our bespoke hardware. But at the time, it could only handle highway driving. So the human testers had to drive manually to the highway and then switch into automated mode once they were on the highway. They complained about this. They thought it was kind of lame that the car couldn't do all streets. Now, you could say that was somewhat ungrateful. We have great free food in our cafeterias, and people sometimes complain about the great free food. But the second thing we learned was much more important. And that was that as soon as the car switched into self-driving mode, the human driver stopped paying any attention whatsoever. People were checking their email. There was one chap who turned around, rummaged around in his bag on the back seat to find a mobile phone charger, plugged it in, and plugged the phone in. All the time, the car was going 60 miles down the highway. So we realized that the assumption that the human driver could be a backup for when the machine would encounter a situation that it couldn't handle was a fallacy. It's not really surprising, right? If we're not paying attention when we're meant to be in charge, it's not surprising that we don't pay attention when we think the car is in charge. So at this point, the team had a choice. Do they keep going with this route of building ever better driver assistance, or do they start over? They actually did decide to start over, which set the program back by probably about 2 years, and they decided to design a car that was fully autonomous, what the industry calls level 5 autonomy. Together with the contract manufacturer in Detroit, we built this rather cute vehicle, which the team affectionately calls Firefly. It's the first car without steering wheel or pedals. It's designed from the ground up for passengers, not for drivers. Firefly is clearly a prototype and not a real car. It was designed as a testing platform to learn. And it was also limited to 25 miles an hour, which led a cop in Mountain View to give it an anti-speeding ticket for not keeping up with the flow of traffic. But it taught us a lot of very important things, and it also enabled the first truly self-driving trip of the world. This is a man called Steve Mahan. He is blind, and he, last year in Austin, Texas, took the world's first truly autonomous ride. There was no human backup driver in the car. There was no controls. It was just Steve in the car. In December 2016, the self-driving car team graduated from X to become their own company called Waymo. To bring their self-driving technology to the world, they're partnering with car companies, starting with Chrysler. And that, on the right, is the first sort of real self-driving car. It's a self-driving version of Chrysler's minivan Pacifica. Now, you might be wondering why it's not some sort of cool-looking sports car. You know, why a mummy van? Well, our user research showed that parents are incredibly keen to get self-driving cars because of the number of trips that they take ferrying their kids around. I'm sure many of you can sympathize. In April, Waymo started an early rider program in Phoenix, Arizona, so people like Candace and her family can now try out our cars and give us feedback. It's still early days for Waymo too, but it's exciting to see that we're on the verge of turning the science fiction into reality in our lifetime. When we started the self-driving car project, people thought we were crazy. And today there are several startups, there are other tech companies, and actually most of the traditional automotive companies now have self-driving car projects. That's great for consumers because it means that this life-saving technology is going to get out into the world faster. And it's changing the entire industry. Instead of thinking about building cars for drivers, it's changing the concept of mobility, of moving from A to B at the press of a button. And that's a really profound shift of perspective. Another industry that's on the verge of being transformed by the fourth industrial revolution is agriculture. It's one of the world's biggest industries. It employs well over 500 million people, and it's under enormous pressure to provide for the ever-increasing world population. Bringing together advances in technology such as satellites, drones, robots, sensors, and machine learning with innovative new business models probably holds the key to both food security and climate security. 100 years ago, a farmer might have never found out about a great machine that was invented somewhere else in the world. Today, they're likely to come across it on the internet. Tomorrow, they'll be able to access precision agriculture with their mobile phone. Now, let me shift gears and talk about how to create the conditions for invention and innovation. And let me start by debunking a great myth. And that is the great myth of the lonely genius inventor. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb alone. In fact, he had a large lab full of people. Apparently, he bossed them around a lot. Steve Jobs didn't make the iPhone by himself. Elon Musk didn't build the Tesla car, and Larry Page and Sergey Brin didn't make the Google search engine by themselves. Great inventions and innovations are always made by great teams. Here's an example of a great team. For much of the 20th century, Bell Labs was the most prolific industrial lab in the world, inventing things like the transistor, the silicon solar cell, the laser, the communication satellite you saw earlier, software products like Unix and C. The list is endless. How did they become so successful? Mainly because of their culture. There was an immense amount of collaboration amongst people from different backgrounds, physicists, chemists, scientists, computer scientists, but also philosophers and even historians. Diversity of thought was actively encouraged. Mervyn Kelly, one of the lab's early leaders, designed it as an institute of creative technology. Their very building in New Jersey was designed to foster this kind of collaboration. They had large open offices, they had an atrium, and they had long corridors which forced people to bump into each other on the way to lunch. At X, we have taken a leaf out of their book. We need an extraordinary range of expertise to make our moonshots happen. And people in our team also have a myriad of backgrounds. We have scientists and engineers, of course, but we also have firefighters, seamstresses. You met Pam earlier. She came from the fashion industry to Project Loon. We have concert pianists, special forces, men and women, diplomats, politicians, journalists, designers, and the guy who built the models for the TV show Mythbusters. Like Bell Labs, our building is a single large open-plan building, which feels like a mix of startup garage and a hardware lab. Some of us are taking two wheels to get around in it. Our desk spaces are deliberately crowded, and we do have cafes at the center of the building with free food to foster serendipitous connections. There's always a bit of a line in the cafe, and I'm told that's deliberate because it makes people talk to each other while they're waiting for their food. Besides the physical environment, we need to give a culture where these schemes can thrive. This means giving them freedom, encouraging diversity of thinking, and giving permission to fail. Isaac Asimov wrote a wonderful essay in 1959 that was never published until one of his collaborators found it in a box. It's now on Tech Review, you can read it. It's called On Creativity. And he postulates that isolation is required to generate new ideas, but then people should be encouraged to share their ideas in cerebration sessions, which are small informal groups. He also lists the inhibitors of creativity that should be removed if possible, such as a sense of embarrassment that one's idea is foolish, a feeling of responsibility to produce, and thirdly, hierarchy amongst the participants. So how do we get creative breakthroughs? Consider a counterintuitive thought, that it is sometimes easier to make things 10 times better than to make them 10% better. Because it forces you to start over, requiring a radically different mindset. Cars that can drive themselves are an example of this. I talked earlier about the shift of perspective from just a concept of providing incrementally more and more driver assistance to the concept of full autonomy. Managing these kind of teams requires a different kind of leadership style. And of all people, General Stanley McChrystal summarizes this approach in his book, Team of Teams. The temptation to lead as a chess master, controlling each move of the organization, must give way to an approach as a gardener, enabling rather than directing. The leader acts as an eyes-on, hands-off enabler who creates and maintains an ecosystem which the organization operates. Gardening, not chess. My mother would love it. Next, I want to talk about failure, a topic people don't like to talk about. Fear of failure is perhaps the biggest impediment to invention and innovation, rather than lack of funds. They are real existential fears. We're afraid of losing our pride, our promotion, our bonus, or even our job if we fail. I come from Europe, where failure traditionally is not something to be proud of. We looked enviously to Silicon Valley, where failure seemed to be a badge of honor. Having lived there for 5 years, I can tell you it's a myth. Nobody in the Valley aims for failure. Everybody aims for success, and most people talk about successes much more than their failures. But perhaps there is something in this, that people in California are better at facing the fear and trying again. To be audacious, you have to be humble, and you have to expect that most of what you work on will not work. At Bell Labs, the researchers had immense freedom to choose whatever they wanted to work on, even if they had no idea where it was going to lead them. I lead early-stage projects at X, so most of the projects I work on also fail. And I'm constantly dealing with these questions. Which projects should we start? Which do we continue? Which shall we stop? How do we decide? How can we maintain psychological safety for our teams in an inherently unstable environment? I think about this almost daily, and I don't have all the answers, but here are some of the things I've learned. The idea of a visionary coming down from the mountain and seeing a clear path to failure is a myth. It means we have to try again and again and again. I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. This quote is often attributed to Edison. We actually don't know who said it first. This means running at the hardest problems first. Imagine you're trying to teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare's sonnets while standing on a pedestal. What do you do first? Teach the monkey or build the pedestal? It's very tempting to first work on the pedestal because we want to work on the things that we know how to solve. We make a list, we knock them out, we feel we've made progress, we feel very good. But it doesn't make sense to solve the easy problems if later on you encounter a problem that you really truly cannot solve. You need to train the monkey first, not waste your time building the pedestal. Second, set kill criteria. Most people set success criteria at the beginning of a project. We imagine what the world looks like when we succeed. We do that too. But we also agree kill criteria up front. I asked my team to make a list of all the reasons why it would not work, both technical and business. And then I asked them to work on the hardest ones first. Let me tell you about one of my favorite projects, Foghorn. The goal of Foghorn was to make a carbon-neutral fuel. We wanted to extract CO2 from seawater, use clean electricity to make hydrogen, and combine them to make a liquid fuel. When it burns, the CO2 gets released back into the atmosphere, but it's a closed carbon cycle. We thought it was brilliant, a way of retrofitting the over 1 billion cars in the world that are not going to be electric overnight. The team figured out how to solve many of the technical challenges. On the left, you see our prototype in the lab at Xerox PARC, who we partnered with. The big bucket is labeled Ocean. That's what went into the machine. And on the right, you see Kathy Cooper-Hannon, who was the project lead, and she holds a small vial of the fuel that the machine produced. But we also set an economic goal to make fuel at the same price as conventional fuel, so that it would be widely adopted. You can probably guess what this chart is. When we started the project, the oil price was at $100 a barrel. Then it went down to 30. At this point, the team decided to close down their own project because it was no longer feasible. They hit their kill criterion. For this brave decision, I gave the team a bonus. They presented their work on their post-mortem at a meeting with all of EXA's staff so everyone could learn from it. And they submitted a paper to a peer-reviewed journal to share their work with the world. I like to think that Project Foghorn is not dead, just deep frozen, because maybe somebody will read our paper and have an idea that we overlooked. And maybe someday in the future, fuel prices will include the true cost of CO2 emissions, allowing seafuel to compete. Making it possible for our teams to be honest with themselves and fail gracefully and move on is a really important part of our culture. We work hard to reduce the existential fears of failure. We decouple individual promotions from project success. We help team members find another role when a project shuts down, and we encourage them to start new ones. We established rituals. We established rituals, such as giving a bonus to a team that shuts down their own project, writing postmortems, and so on. But these are all very rational methods of dealing with failure. And I've learned that it's just as important to deal with the emotional side. So humor can help. We have a team called Rapid Evaluation. They look at hundreds of ideas, and very few of them turn into a project. So if a rapid evaluator ends one of these investigations, they get a little sticker. And it's a crumpled paper sticker, and they proudly display them on their laptops. But undeniably, there's a dark side. And when a project ends, we all grieve. In the 1960s, psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed a model of the stages of grief that we go through when a loved one dies. I was struck to the similarity of what happens with our teams. We can reduce the first 3 stages, denial, anger, and bargaining, by setting kill criteria and involving the team in the decision-making. But after that, always comes depression before acceptance. Last November, X celebrated Dia de los Muertos, a Mexican tradition to celebrate and mourn the dead. The idea came from 2 Latinas on my team, but all of X took part. It was a traditional Dia ceremony with dancers, drummers, a shaman, and an altar designed by an artist with help from X's. We invited exes to look inward and take the time to let go. They mourned the loved ones they lost, failed marriages, failed prototypes, and failed projects. They brought pictures and artifacts to the altar. They grieved and they celebrated. They gave themselves permission to let go and moved on. So far, I've talked mostly about what happens inside a lab setting. In medieval times, inventors flocked to the courts, where a benefactor funded their inventing. And in the 20th century, much inventing was done in the great labs, like Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, NASA, CERN, and Fraunhofer. They were attractors of the best minds, and Silicon Valley companies are built on their legacy. While engineers in those labs are great at inventing breakthrough technologies, they're sometimes a long way away from people who are going to use them, both temporarily, but also physically and culturally. And there's an important part to play for innovation and invention that happens locally, tapping into the talent across the world. Let me give you 2 examples. Proximity Designs was set up by a Burmese-American couple, Debbie Ang Din and Jim Taylor. Their mission is to bring technology to smallholder farmers in Myanmar, for example, solar-powered irrigation systems. When Jim told me about a new water sensor they were designing, I asked him how it works. How does it collect the data? Is it connected with Wi-Fi or with Bluetooth? He laughed, and he said, the sensors have a display on the top. There's a person that walks around the team, looks at the display, and makes a decision about whether to water or not. I felt foolish. Jim's designers and engineers understand their local user, and they invent technology that is sometimes very simple, but solves the problem. And with their products, they've lifted thousands of farmers out of poverty. Another example is Brick, a hardware company based in Nairobi that was founded by Eric Hirschman and Juliana Rotek. They're working on devices for internet access in rural Kenya. They're very complementary to Loon. In May, they launched their Super Brick, a waterproof solar-powered Wi-Fi box. The solar cell was actually invented by Bell Labs back in 1954, and now it's being deployed by innovators like Proximity and Brick all over the world. So here's a quick summary of the conditions for invention. Great teams, not great men. Gardening, not chess. Learn fast, monkeys, not pedestals. Empower the team with kill criteria. Establish rituals, and ideas truly come from everywhere. This brings me to the final part of my talk. All of these changes have a profound impact on society. The promise of the 4th Industrial Revolution is that it will raise income levels and improve quality of life, like those which preceded it. In their book, The Second Machine Age, MIT economists Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee are optimistic about the future because technology is the only free lunch that economists believe in. And it's happening faster than our expectations. But they also raise concerns that it may leave a lot of people, organizations, and institutions behind. The digital revolution of the past 2 decades has brought enormous benefits to consumers and businesses. We can read the news, we can watch videos, check the weather forecast and market prices. We can buy groceries, book flights, talk to our doctor, connect to our loved ones, wherever we are in the world. Businesses can sell all over the world. But not all people have equal access to technology, which creates a digital divide. I already talked about the fact that over half of the world's population doesn't yet have access to the internet, and that if we don't bring them online, they will be left behind. There's another way in which these revolutions could increase inequality. We're going to see a shift in employment, and as we head into the 4th Industrial Revolution, there'll be another wave of automation, which creates a lot of fear. Again, this is nothing new. In the 19th century, the Luddites in England destroyed automated looms. In Das Kapital, Karl Marx wrote, "The instrument of labor, when it takes the form of a machine, immediately becomes a competitor of the workman himself." He also noted that it would be some time before the workers were able to distinguish between the machines and the form of society which utilizes these instruments. Throughout the 20th century, there were headlines calling out the fear of robots replacing people. But in every previous wave, technology did replace more jobs. It did create more jobs than it replaced. Some people think it's different this time, since we have machines with artificial intelligence, smart machines that can do more than ever before. In 1997, Deep Blue beat Kasparov at chess. In 2016, DeepMind's AlphaGo beat Go legend Lee Sedol. There's music software that is so good at composing that concert goers could not distinguish between its compositions and Bach. There are journalism bots writing pieces without human input. Some stock exchanges have no traders anymore. And self-driving cars and trucks can replace taxi and truck drivers. Who knows? One day there might be a robot standing in front of you instead of me. Personally, I'm optimistic that the impact will be positive overall. First of all, there is no data yet to tell us what the net impact of AI and automation will be. It's entirely possible that the displacement of workers by technology will result in a net increase in safe and rewarding jobs. Second, there are many jobs that we should be happy to hand to the robots. I will cheer when there's no more sweatshops working children to the bone, or people forced to risk their lives to mine precious stones. Finally, we are not powerless. We do know that this new wave of automation will change the nature of the jobs we all do, and we need to adapt. The McKinsey Global Institute put out an excellent report in January 2017, which analyzed 2,000 distinct work activities within jobs to assess which ones could be automated. They concluded that very few occupations will be fully automated, but 60% of all occupations will at least 30% of tasks that will be automated. So that means that more occupations will change than will be automated away, and humans will continue to work alongside machines. In case you're wondering, the activities that are most likely to be automated, according to McKinsey, are physical activities in highly structured environments and the collection and processing of data. So herein lies the solution. To handle the changing employment landscape, we need to focus on improving education, both at school and for adults. Many of the jobs that today's school starters will have not yet been invented. We need education systems that promote project work and independent thinking, rather than professional training for specific roles once in someone's career. We need to build creative confidence to equip children with the skills and psychological capacity to cope with a world that's ever-changing around them. We also need to invest more in workplace retraining, so people in jobs where many tasks will be replaced get the support they need to transition. Jutta Almendinger is a German sociology professor whose research interests focus on inequality and educational reform. She found that people with diverse skills and a higher level of education feel less threatened by new technology and are more able to change roles. And she argues that we need to change our education system to enable lifelong learning. There are some new models emerging, online education like Khan Academy or MOOCs and nanodegrees, as well as hands-on science and technology learning in makerspaces and fab labs. And Michael tells me you might be setting up a makerspace right here in Chautauqua in the bottom of his office. But those are only scratching the surface, and they're not yet mainstream. And I think education is one of the big unsolved problems of our time. So this brings me to my close. We have a choice about which world we want to live in. Our future could be a world where the largest beneficiaries of inventions are the owners of intellectual and physical capital, the innovators, the shareholders, the investors. That's where we're heading now. And is leading to a hollowing out of the middle class and an increasing sense of unfairness and discontent in Europe, the US, and across the world. Or we can collaborate to make our future a world of inclusive innovation. A world where invention and innovation doesn't just come from labs and companies in New York and New Jersey, San Francisco and Silicon Valley, but from everywhere, and where broad swathes of society benefit from it. I want to remind us why this matters so much. This isn't just about fairness. It's about bringing all the talent to the table to solve the grand challenges of our time. In 2015, UN world leaders adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which universally apply to all. There are so many unsolved problems in the world: poverty, inequality, disease, and climate change. The challenge that lies before us and before our children and grandchildren is enormous. Technology, of course, will not solve all problems, and there's no doubt that it will create some new ones. But it is up to us how we use technology to make a better future for ourselves and for generations to come. This age cannot be the last grand age of invention and innovation. We need more inventors, more innovators, more moonshot takers from everywhere across the globe, men and women. We need to nurture these moonshot takers in the next generation. Will it be hard? Of course, it will be. I will close with the original moonshot. In 1962, President Kennedy set the goal of going to the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. And we still pay tribute to the men and the women who took up his challenge. Let's play this video, and I think some of you might be recognizing the lady who stars in it.
The actual moonshot is wonderful, inspirational, poetic, beautiful, involved great technical challenges, genuine heroism. It brought the world together. But think about the Polynesian islander on the dugout canoe, deciding one day they were going to go that way. No one had ever been that way before. No one even knew if there was anything that way before. It was amazing, and it changed the world.
People can set their minds to magical, seemingly impossible ideas, and then through science and technology, bring them to reality. And that then sets other people on fire, that other things that look impossible might be accomplishable.
Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there.
Everyone else in the world is working on that next 10%. If you can be the one that delivers that 10 times improvement, you have a chance to really change things.
If you want cars to run at 50 miles per gallon, fine, you can retool your car a little bit. But if I tell you it has to run on a gallon of gas for 500 miles, you have to start over.
You need a lot of courage in this work, and you need a lot of persistence. Even if you don't really 100% believe it's possible, like you might think this might be possible, have the courage to try. That's how the greatest things have happened.
You don't spend your time being bothered that you can't teleport from here to Japan, because there's a part of you that thinks it's impossible. Moonshot thinking is choosing to be bothered by that.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Humanity's progress has been a series of amazing, audacious things, from the very small and personal up to the great, big, and grand. And we are a species of moonshots. And to me, that's like the really amazing, poetic, and inspirational thing.
When you find your passion, you're unstoppable. You can make amazing things happen. It's been true through all of history.
When Kennedy said that we would put a man on the moon, it's about the fact that he said, we don't know how to do this yet, and we're gonna do it anyway. And that sends chills up everybody's spine. Because if that happens, what couldn't we do?
Thank you.
Thank you. We know that some community members are headed off to other programs, and we'd ask that you do that as quietly as possible in consideration of those Chautauquans who are able to stay for our question and answer portion. It's also fun to see you have Thomas Edison in there, who spent many a summer on these shores, and then to include our great Chautauquan Megan Smith in that, so bringing invention in Chautauqua. While we gather our questions for you this morning, I have one to start, and you mentioned the Millennium Sustainability Goals. I wonder, as you and your team are putting together thoughts of innovation and invention, how do you account for humanity in that? Because I think there's a lot of fear with people about technological advances that somehow we'll lose our humanity. How does that factor into your thinking and your thought process?
Absolutely. So my job title is about bringing the technology in contact with the real world, and that always means reaching out to the people who will be affected. So both the people who will be using the technology, but also bystanders. So with self-driving cars, for instance, it's not just the person who sits in the car, but it's also the whole community in the neighborhood that the cars are roaming. And when we first started our test drives in Mountain View, there was a lot of apprehension about, robot cars roaming. But as the community kind of got used to it and was invited in, they could sort of see the benefits more. And I think that process is incredibly important.
Thank you. Just a reminder for those that are joining us online that you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2017. And our first question comes from Twitter. What should government's role be in innovation in the private sector?
Right. So the government's role has changed a lot, right? The original Moonshot was entirely funded by the government, of course, and that's no longer the case. Although organizations like DARPA, as you saw with self-driving cars, are often still the seed for much invention. From our point of view, there's an important role for governments to play, not just to encourage the next generation with education and so on, but also to cooperate with us in bringing this technology to society. So, for instance, when we started out, there was no laws around self-driving cars at all. And so we've been working with regulators in a number of jurisdictions to kind of work out what should be the safety regulations around this kind of technology. That interaction, I think, is incredibly important, and it can be hard for lawmakers because they have to learn these new technologies as they go along.
So someone notes all this technology, and you're still speaking with the aid of oversized note cards. Can you say a word about the integration versus replacement of traditional and emerging modes of communication? And do you think we're better off with both?
So this is an interesting question. I was actually asked that on a trip to Germany by the German environment minister, where she said, I can't really see people using self-driving cars, because she thought of it very much as a single mode of transport. You'd own one, it would sit in your driveway. But I don't think that's how they're going to work. I think you'll see autonomous vehicles that are very much integrated with existing transportation systems. So if you might live in a village outside a town and the self-driving car takes you to the nearest transport hub, they could be self-driving buses that are run by the municipality, for example. So again, I think if the technology is integrated into people's lives, that's when it becomes truly useful, not by itself.
The question of how do you believe we can best encourage business to innovate for all and not just the privileged few? What sort of incentives should be used to sway business to look beyond their own personal best interest?
Yeah. So I feel incredibly passionate about this, as you probably noticed. That's why Project Loon sort of caught my imagination. It was the project that first brought me to X, because that's exactly the situation we now have with internet access, is that it's still a privilege of richer people in Western countries, but that's changing incredibly, incredibly rapidly. At X, our mission is to have impact and make money, and it's deliberately in that sequence. So we wouldn't do something that just makes money and doesn't have a positive impact on the world. But the reason why, as a business, we also do have to make it economical is because otherwise it will not grow. If it's not self-funding, it will not reach the scale that's required to solve these large problems. And I think that's the biggest problem right now that we're facing with climate change, for instance, is that it's just not economical to compete with incredibly cheap oil and gas whilst the carbon pricing whilst the cost of carbon is not priced into goods.
So a technological question about the Project X. What happens to the balloons? Do you recycle them? Do they end up being garbage? And how do you address that?
Yeah, so we do recycle them. I mentioned we have a lot of ex-service men and women. That team, the operations team, is the one that goes and retrieves balloons. They've been out in the ocean on boats. They've climbed to the top of the Himalayas, and they've been on the top of the Sierras in California many, many times to collect the balloons. The balloon itself is like a large plastic bag, so it's not reusable because it's very fragile. So when it hits the earth, we can't really do anything with it anymore apart from recycle it. But the payload, so all the communication systems underneath, we upgrade and reuse.
Great, thanks. There's been a lot in the news lately about hacking and the impact of hacking, and there's a concern, does too much technology make us vulnerable to hacking, and how should we think about that, and what might we do about it?
Right. I mean, that's a very valid concern, especially as more and more kind of infrastructure is accessible to, is driven by software, right? So like energy or companies as well as government. That is one of the problems we're going to have to solve, and cybersecurity is one of the fastest growing markets at the moment. At the end of the day, it's possible to protect company networks. It means that we should be able to protect everything else. What it does mean, though, is that the devices itself probably shouldn't have quite so much intelligence in them. So a lot of the kind of hacking at the moment into someone's house, for instance, is because your camera is a very primitive device that runs a full software stack. So it'd be better if the camera had no brains and the brain was actually sitting in the cloud, which is easier to protect.
A question from Twitter. Google originally didn't have many or any women in leadership and now seems to be more balanced. Why was that? How did that happen? And what's your thoughts on the role of women in innovation?
Right. So one of my side projects is I head up diversity and inclusion for X, which I took on about a year and a half ago because I looked around me and I thought there's so much more we should do. So the technology industry's diversity numbers are still not great. It's about so Alphabet, which is our mother company's numbers, are about 30% of the overall staff are women, and about 20% of the technology roles are women. And part of the reason that happened is because of networks. So a lot of people in the early days joined Google because they were referred by somebody else. And of course, you refer other people who you know, so before you have it, there's a lot of people who went to Stanford and MIT and who are white and boys who study computer science. And so the only way we can turn that around is actually to much more proactively go out and find people who are not in these kind of traditional networks. But the other thing is we have a lot of work to do still in the tech industry to make it good for the people who work there already. So there was an article in The Atlantic a few weeks ago which was entitled, it was like something like "Why Silicon Valley is Terrible for Women." I encourage you to look it up. It was a very balanced piece, despite the headlines, of what the experience is like, and it ranges from absolutely terrible to pretty good. We're in the pretty good category, I'm pleased to say, but there's definitely a lot of work to be done. And if you look at corporate boards, the numbers are also quite astonishing. So about 20% of board seats are held by women in large public companies in the US, but in Silicon Valley it's 10%. Only about 5% of venture capital in the Valley goes to women, and clearly that's not commensurate with the talent. So I have some ideas. I'm happy to talk to people in the break about how to break that, because it's one of the areas that I'm passionate about. And so is Megan Smith, who's been evangelizing for the nation on this.
So a member of the community asks, do any members of the X team work remotely? Do you think it's possible to foster the same culture and collaboration if everyone's not in the building? And certainly you showed images of buildings and talked about meeting in the lunch line and how that fosters innovation.
It's a great question. So we do have some people who work remotely. I mean, for starters, as we're starting to take our projects out into the world, you know, we now have a team in Peru, for instance. I work 1 day a week from home for my sanity, because I've got quite a long commute from San Francisco down to the Valley, and I do like to pick up my daughter on a Friday afternoon from school. But I can tell that there is a lot of value in people being together. So whilst we enable people to work remotely, like, you wouldn't be able to do it all the time. And that's because the technology is not quite there yet to make you feel as if you're in the office. No? One day, video conferencing will be good enough. Right now, it still cuts out. It's incredibly annoying. Usually when somebody is saying something really important, or when you want to say something really important, the video line goes down. So I think that's a matter of time. Like, at some point, we'll be able to work remotely much more effectively. There's some experiments, like there's little robots that roam the halls that have a sort of monitor with someone's face on them, but it's a very imperfect replacement for being in that kitchen. And maybe one day we'll figure out how to do time travel, and then we could just commute that way.
There's
like Doctor Who.
A lot of great questions, which I'll be sure to share with you as you head back to the porch. But the last one that we have for you, because of time, is there any emerging technology that scares you?
Is there any emerging technology that scares me? It's a great question. I don't think so. I don't think I'm scared about any technology. It's not that I'm never scared about the technology per se. It's about the application. It's about how we use it, not the technology. The technology is relatively neutral, right? But you can use a drone to deliver food, and you can use a drone to deliver bombs. So what I'm scared of is what people might do with the technology, not the technology itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Obi Felten.
Thank you.